Where the initial rollout of 5G will most likely be in bands below 3 gigahertz. So there are some bands which will be below 1 gigahertz, which will probably be either a combination of new bands which are identified in coming years, or existing bands which are already used for 2G, 3G and 4G, which are refarmed for 5G. And by using those bands, then 5G will probably get wider area coverage. And then you have a series of bands where you have existing 3G, 4G at 2 gigahertz, around 2 gigahertz, where UMTS was initially deployed, and around 2.5, 2.6 gigahertz. So again, most likely those bands will get refarmed. And then staying below 3 gigahertz, there is a band at 1.4 gigahertz, which is identified in Europe and in some other countries for essentially mobile broadcast. Okay. And since 5G data consumption for the average consumer will probably be video-based heavily, that band I personally think will become an important band, certainly in Europe and in some other parts of the world. Maybe more complicated in the US, but certainly in Europe and Africa it will work. And I think you'll see that the vendors will bring chipsets to work in that band. So then moving into the next series of bands, Europe has already made a decision to identify 3.4, 3.8 gigahertz for mobile broadband, and it's a pioneer band. Sorry, it's not a pioneer band, it's a priority band for 5G within the European Union. And you'll probably see the US is currently between 3.4 to 3.7 gigahertz. There's some effort to change that boundary. So that 400 megahertz roughly in most parts of the world will go to 5G-ish or maybe 4.5G-ish services. And then in those bands, depending on the national policies of the countries, existing satellite services will need to be protected. Then you have the next WRC, which is going to look at millimeter wave, potential for millimeter wave frequency bands for 5G or IMT 2020, as they call it in ITU. And there you have various frequency bands in a shopping list, which is defined in something called ITU Resolution 238. And it's a very clear shopping list of candidate bands and what is supposed to stay with those candidate bands. So my guess, if I was to guesstimate looking at the positions of the major regional bodies, which is Europe, the CIS group of countries, where they've got some strong preliminary positions going to the WRC, and then you have the Arab group and you've got the African group. Probably the bands which will be identified will be 26 gigahertz, which is a high priority EU pioneer band. And again, if I was to guess, something around 40 to 50 gigahertz, and then something else around 66 to 71 or 66 to 76 gigahertz. So there's a fair amount of spectrum which is likely going to get a label saying this can be used in future for 5G or IMT 2020. And I think the real debate now is under what technical conditions and regulatory conditions that is identified at the WRC. And that should keep everybody happy going forward. Leaving aside the bands below 3 gigahertz, it's 3.4 to 3.8 gigahertz, which is part of an EU-wide community decision. There's some more work to be done. They will probably within the next year define another European Union decision, which will solidify the legal basis for 26 gigahertz. And I think they just have to go out and sell it. Okay, and Europe has to take the leadership with its member states, and both through the European Union and through CPT. By and large, I think, from my earlier comments, the African region is sort of going the same direction as Europe. The Arab region is likely to go a similar region, and the CIS region. So there's a very large group of countries, and then you'll find some Asian countries and some in Latin America doing that. So I think Europe just has to stay the course, and it has to lobby, has to talk to other regulators and engage. And the results of that should lead to large blocks of spectrum being harmonized on if not on a global basis, on a multi-regional basis, and that should lead to economies of scale on 5G equipment, and then that should bring the benefits to the consumer. But I think there's no doubt that the first generation of 5G will not be 5G to mobiles in millimeter wave bands. It will be fixed wireless access, which is a different beast. So I think Europe is pretty much on a roll, the way I would put it this way. So I think it'll be. So if you look at Forum Europe's activities, you hold these conferences not just in Europe but in other regions. And I've been lucky enough to be invited to, I think, the last 3 conferences here. And you've had conferences in North America, I think in parts of Africa and Latin America. So I think the opportunity is it actually brings both industry, vendors and operators and regulators all into the same room. And it's a very good networking opportunity. Probably you'll also have some other people who are relatively new to the scene, but I think the main opportunity is a networking session, and you probably don't learn something which is radically new, but you get a context and a feel for where the mood is going in certain spectrum policy decisions, and you have an opportunity to talk. And that, I think the earlier you talk about differences of views in this forum and similar fora, the easier it is to find consensus at big IT conferences. So it brings enormous value, and I would congratulate Forum Europe for the way you've organized this over many years.